Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Tuesday, March 4th, 2025, and today we're going to talk about killing your kale in a good way and digital garden planning options versus just doing the whole thing on your own. So let's do it. All right, well, welcome to Tuesday, everyone. Soccer practices have begun, and I'm all in. Love being outside, love being with the kids. It's going to be a brutal 2 months, but I've coached some of these kids for like 2 or more years, and I just love being around them. It's an absolute blast. I did wake up with somewhat of a pinched nerve in my back this morning, so that's a good sign of things to come. We'll see how that goes. I did not get a ton of interesting stuff done on the farm yesterday, except I did start working on my tractor finally and getting it ready for the season. I'm not a machine person, and it's a bit like pulling teeth in my brain to get me to focus on doing anything with machines. But I will be psyched about having done it in about a month when I won't have any time. So anyway, I'm trying to do at least one crop breakdown every week. And I thought I would do this crop breakdown about one of my favorite early bunching greens, the mighty kale. Kale has gained a lot of popularity in the last decade or so, like a lot. When I first started farming, people still thought of kale almost strictly as a salad bar garnish. There was a viral tweet many years ago that up until 2013, Pizza Hut was the largest purchaser of kale. And though several organizations have attempted to fact check whether Pizza Hut was the biggest buyer and came up short, it is true that Pizza Hut bought boatloads of the stuff for their epic salad bars. A spokesperson told Today that Pizza Hut purchased around 14,000 pounds in 2012, which had to at least put them in contention for being the largest kale buyer at the time. Anyway, now obviously kale's health benefits and culinary contributions are significantly more appreciated, so it is not the hard sell that it once was. Kale soups, kale salads, I'm particularly fond of kale pesto, especially on pizza. Kale now has a market. And to be sure, I've already done a really long breakdown of our kale production in video form, but I figured let's do a specific spring kale breakdown for the show today and talk about how to grow some great kale successfully without pests or with few pests, potentially that last you all the way until the fall or through the fall or forever. Probably not forever. A long time. All right, so varieties. Although most kale varieties grow fine in the spring, I find that the red and white Russian types grow the best for us here in Kentucky Zone 6B, but the challenge with those is that not every customer recognizes them as kale. The average customer, at least in my experience, expects kale to be kind of curly, or like the lacinato/dino kale, where it's a bit more maybe savoid than curly. But yeah, people do tend to recognize that one, and the Tuscan kales also tend to be a favorite of chefs. But the challenge with those flat leaf types, like the red Russian, the white Russian, etc., is that most people just don't see it as kale. Flavor, yield, and growth-wise, they are excellent. So if the market is not an issue, for me, they are a no-brainer in the spring. Now, the winter boar and darker boar and red boar and West Lance, which I don't know, didn't get the boar memo for whatever reason, those super curly types will all grow fine in the spring too, but in my experience, they are not quite as heat hardy. For us, the plants really become too stressed in the summer to adequately protect themselves, whereas we can usually convince the flat leaf varieties to hang out until at least July without an issue in the field. Extending it beyond that would take more work for as hot and humid as our summers are, but good consistent irrigation, perhaps the occasional or full-time application of shade cloth, plus regular fertilization could enable you to grow kale all summer, even in warmer climates. Growing it in a very well-ventilated tunnel would help as well because it basically becomes a giant shade house if you ventilate it enough, which if you can grow it all summer and get good, healthy growth, that would be ideal and certainly preferable than having to restart it in the fall. So anyway, we start our earliest kale in February using the 35 block standing blocker. So that's like 1 1/8 inch cubes. If we didn't use that, we'd probably just use 1/28, or honestly, I'd prefer to use something like the 72 cell wind strips. Anywhere between that 1 inch and 2 inch size would work. You just want them a little bit bigger because you want that extra space for the kale to grow tall enough to get them at least close to that last frost date before you plant them. But we'll talk about planting in the third segment. Almost forgot how many segments were in this show. So I add 1 or 2 seeds per block, usually with the intention of 1 plant per block. 2 plants, you can do that. It just creates kind of small leaves. But if you wanted to smaller leaves for your market or whatever, you could plant them closer together and even leave a couple seeds per block. Mostly though, customers like the big leaves and fewer stems or less stems, which when they're planted really close together, you get lots of stems, not as many leaves. Kale has a pretty good germination window temperature-wise, starting in that 59 degrees Fahrenheit range, or that's like 15 Celsius, all the way up into the 90s Fahrenheit or mid-30s Celsius. That's really high for germination. Germination really peaks for kale, in fact, in the high 80s or around 30 Celsius. And I imagine that this heat tolerance or even heat love of the seed is because it really is more of a fall winter plant that often needs to germinate in the late summer soils. Kale does require high humidity, so make sure trays are moist, but that goes for basically every crop. You need to keep them moist. They don't really love drying out. So anyway, we seed the trays, cover them lightly with soil mix, and store them somewhere warm or on a heat mat to get the germination temperatures we want. Like all things, once we see the germs, we take them out of the dark and put them into the greenhouse where they can get light. If it's late in the spring or in the summer, we will cover them with insect netting, even in the trays, because flea beetles, cabbage moths, aphids, and armyworms, they will all find them. So that's starting kale, and we will return to our kale plants in the third segment. But for right now, let's talk about garden planting options. Yeah, why not? BRB.
Come tend the garden with me. We have so many seeds to sow. When the harvest comes in, it will be time to share what we have grown.
Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Peaceful Heritage Nursery. If you're looking for hardy and resilient fruit trees, berry plants, or pawpaw trees, then check out Peaceful Heritage Nursery. Peaceful Heritage Nursery LLC is a mail-order nursery shipping premium quality fruit trees and berry plants across the USA. They specialize in resilient, non-GMO plant genetics for small growers. Their diverse selection includes berries, cold hardy figs, passion fruits, gumi, mulberry, and much more. They're famous for their diverse selection of premium quality grafted pawpaw trees. 5-star Google ratings and customer testimonials attest to their commitment to excellence in quality and service. Find them at peacefulheritage.com and join the mailing list. Once again, find them at peacefulheritage.com. Use the promo code NOTILL for 10% off your first order. Today's episode is also brought to you by So Right Seeds. So Right Seeds is an heirloom seed company that offers fresh, high-quality, open-pollinated seeds. They have a great selection on their website of over 400 varieties, along with a planter's library with tips for growing. They offer cover crops and bulk packs of seed for sustainable home gardening. The instructions on the back of their packets have all the information you need to get started. Go to So Right Seeds, that's SOW, and use my discount code NOTILL for 15% off your order. That's SoRightSeeds.com. All right, enjoy the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions now. Today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Connolly Farm and Garden, who writes, quote, "New to the group, looking for recommendations for planning, organizing data, etc. for varieties, timings, all of it," with the sweat emoji, "running on Excel and debating on investing in something else," end quote. All right, great. Great question. And so you will find that there are like 1,000,001 options out there for crop planning apps. I have not investigated all of them. If an established crop planning app or site is of interest to you, what I would do is go through the free trials offered by several of those crop planning apps. I know at least a few of them offer like tutorials and those sorts of things, so you can poke around inside, sometimes even with the help of a technician from the organization. I don't use any of those apps and don't have any specific recommendations, but I did poke around like Seed Time, I think it was called, a couple years back, and it seemed really professional. And full disclosure, they have sponsored our work. I can link that in the show notes. But I think a lot of them, like Seed Time, really take it seriously and do a good job. So there are others out there like that as well. For our organic certification, which is kind of different, but we used Cog Pro, which looks like it's straight out of the 90s. But maybe like most things that are made a really long time ago, it actually holds up better. I don't know. It actually worked relatively well for us for what we needed for the organic certification stuff. Plus, we could use it to track yields and that sort of thing as well if we went back and kind of went through the system. It wasn't a perfect application, and like I said, it was a bit outdated visually, but it did the trick for us, honestly. However, I should also say that if you're wanting to up your spreadsheet game, check out Farmer Dan Brisebois' Spreadsheet Academy. It's built around farming and building out spreadsheets specifically for farming. I will link all that stuff in the show notes. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of Dan's, and the spreadsheet stuff is really helpful, and he's brilliant. So make sure to check out his work if you have any interest in improving your spreadsheet skills. I think doing your own spreadsheets to be able to monitor your own farming is nice because you can get exactly the data that matters to you, and also like in the format that you like it. So upping those skills is at least worth exploring. I also know that there's a lot that can be done with Airtable, and we use Airtable a little bit for keeping track of sponsors here for no-till growers, but of course that's not exactly the same thing as keeping track of planning and planting and harvesting dates and all that stuff. Oh, and I should also shout out the book that Dan co-authored, a classic book called, let me see if I have it. I do have it. It's right here. Crop Planning for Organic Vegetable Growers. This one, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. It's out of Canada. It is also a COG book. I wonder if that's where COG Pro comes from. You'd think I'd know that. Anyway, everyone should own that book. It's really, really good. I'll link that as well in the show notes. As I've talked about before on the show, it's good to know what you're trying to track and what questions you have. Some of these crop planning apps will be overkill for some of you, but certain personalities, and especially in the first years of this business, they can certainly provide a nice starting point at very least. And like I said, there are a ton of those crop planning apps out there, and many of them are good, but I would definitely suggest finding one that will help you develop a plan for your specific climate and situation that would not be too hard to revisit in the field as you work, which is another part of it. For that reason, I kind of really like the Google Sheets and Google Docs for most things we do because it's easiest to share it with other people. And if you're doing, say, a work list on Google Docs, everyone can see what has already been done or not done yet without having to like call each other or text each other or however you communicate. Anyway, that sort of technology can be really helpful. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk a bit more about succession planning, planting strategies. So for those of you still in the crop planning phase, make sure to be on the lookout for that one. Anyway, I hope that was at least mildly helpful and not too late for you. Thanks for the great question. And when we come back, we will finish out our kale. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Harnwah Greenhouses. Harnwah Greenhouses has pioneered controlled environment agriculture since 1965, partnering with market gardeners and farmers across North America to deliver turnkey greenhouse solutions. Their unwavering mission is to support growers' success through innovation and expertise in design, manufacturing, and installation. Harnwah Greenhouses are engineered to withstand high wind and snow loads, providing optimal brightness, increased yields, rapid ROI, and long-lasting durability. With over 20,000 projects completed, they are more than a manufacturer. They are a trusted partner. Their structures foster sustainable, energy-efficient ecosystems that drive profitable, resilient agriculture. In 2025, Harnwah is introducing a new low-tech, high-tunnel model starting at just $2 per square foot, offering open field growers an accessible entry into controlled environment agriculture. Learn more at harnwah.com. That's HARNOIS.com. All right, back to the show. All right, so let's return to our kale trays now that they are sprouted and growing away in the greenhouse, presumably. So on our farm, we like to grow our kale out until it is much like we do with the lettuce, fully covering the tray and is a few inches tall. That's generally, when it comes to greens, a good rule, just like cover the whole tray. But also, I won't let the plant really decide when they're ready to go in the garden as much as I will let the weather decide that. Kale is a biennial, meaning that if it thinks it went through a fall, the germination period, and then a winter, like a heavy cold snap in the garden, then it will bolt. There is almost nothing more depressing than spending 2 months or so growing a crop that bolts or dies in the field before you get anything off of it. Sure, kale flowers are a market item and great for beneficials, and they are delicious, but not as delicious as months and months of kale harvests. It's just math. So ideally, you do not put the kale in the garden before you are certainly past that last chance of freeze, preferably the last chance of frost. Planting later will also, in my experience, help reduce your risk of aphids, which can be an issue when the weather and soil is cool. That said, in terms of risk of bolting, with a little row covering, the kale will be fine, and in fact, it may heat the soil just enough to reduce aphid issues. Aphids are something I have not yet explored for the show too much, but I will get there soon enough. In fact, really soon. It's a big topic and a good one. Flea beetles also come out fairly early in the season, and row cover will protect from them as well. Not 100%, but that definitely reduces their numbers, limits their movement, that sort of stuff. They adore the tender greens and will devour them into oblivion if they're not covered. So covering the young plants is never a bad idea, even in the best soils. For fertilization, I like either a good fertilizing compost from something like chicken manure, or even something like alfalfa meal has done really well for us in our gardens. When amending, especially with something other than compost, check your soil test. And in fact, you have to do that in organic certification. You can't just put stuff on the soil or on plants based on feel or experience. Depending on the soil test you got, you can even ask for recommendations of what to apply, and that will help you narrow down which nitrogenous amendment or amendments to utilize. Like I said, it's never a bad idea to cover young kale plants, but not just for the tiny pests like flea beetles. In the spring, before a lot of fodder has erupted in the woods and pastures, the garden can be a prime target for deer, rabbits, that sort of stuff. So the covering, at least for us, helps warm the soil a bit and protect the kale from both frost and micropests, but also the big ones. Our cabbage moths don't typically show up until like mid to late May, so we don't worry about cabbage moths typically until we start to see them. For cabbage moths, well, first, just grow a lot of flowers. They do have predators if you're willing to keep something flowering around all season to help feed those predators. Also, wasps. Learn to love your wasps. We get lots of wasps in our garden who will straight up eat cabbage worms like nobody's business. I spend way too much time now just kind of watching wasps in our kale. It's kind of become both a pastime and a problem productivity-wise, but wasps for the win. Who knew? Except for entomologists, probably. They probably knew. Anyway, for organic treatments, Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacterium that can kill cabbage worms, and for organic growers, it's the typical play here, also called BT, or you can order OMRI, so organically compliant BT, from a lot of different places online, and there are a few different types, so just make sure that you get the BTK. That's the one that specifically targets worms. I'm happy to do a whole segment on BT at some point because it's also very interesting. Also, a question that comes up a lot is, will good soil get you kale with no issues? Maybe sometimes, but I find that kale in the summer is just stressed out, and things like cabbage moths seize on that. Any row cover you add, however, needs to be taken off on very hot days unless it's the thin insect netting that we've talked about before. Oh, I didn't talk about spacing, did I? Similar to, well, basically everything. The closer the plants, the smaller the leaves. So I like anywhere from 14 to 18 inches between plants, though down to a foot is fine, and especially in well-drained, like fertile soil. On 30-inch beds or 75 centimeters, we used to go with 2 rows. Now that we're on 48-inch beds, or what is that, 122 centimeters, I can do up to 4 rows with the plants staggered at 18 inches apart, but I prefer 3 rows to give them a little bit of elbow room. Irrigation can be overhead or drip, though if your spring is anything like ours, irrigation isn't a huge concern until like late May most years for us. But if you are in a drier climate, you have to have your irrigation plan laid out before you plant because kale is a thirsty crop. Once it's full grown, if you are worried about pests, you can keep the insect netting on and just remove it for the harvest. Kale is usually last on the list of greens we harvest. The order is mostly like tender stuff first, then bunching greens like kale and chard. Then we move on to crops less affected by heat like squash, tomatoes, that sort of stuff. So we bunch them in the field with rubber bands on our wrists and place them in bins. Then we take the bins to the cooler to get the field heat off. If it's a super hot day, we will harvest as quickly as we can, dunk them in water, and then spin the bunches dry, and then get them in the cooler. Getting that field heat off is key to quality and longevity. Some growers can keep their kale going all summer. We have struggled with that a little bit in the field here, but the tunnel is a place where if that's a big market for you or a food item for you and you have the space in your tunnel, we don't usually, but if you did, you could pull that off. However, we'll still need regular nitrogen updates, i.e., refertilizing with something like fish hydrolysate or just more compost. So yeah, that's kale. What are your kale go-to varieties, recipes? What did I miss? I think a baby kale episode in the future wouldn't hurt either. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music you hear. Pick up a copy of The Living Soil Handbook or The Seed Farmer by Dan Brisebois. I've said his name 3 times today. That's awesome. Huge fan of Dan's. Anyway, pick those up from no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or sign up in the month of March, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Mark, Scott Freeze, and Marnie McGregor. These are all very novelistic. I mean, Mark's a little short for a novelistic name, but these are all good. It never ends. This is the This is the story of a few ski bums who basically like go to work in like various ski resorts all over the country. So they'll go up to Vermont, they'll go over to Aspen or wherever, and then in the summertime they'll go work on farms near the beach so they can, surf and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, they're out one day deep in the Rockies. They're just kind of sitting there watching their footage, and they hear this roar, right? And so they look behind them and they see a Yeti, and it's battling with something. And they're like, oh my gosh, Yeti. We got to get this on film. So they start filming it. And then they realize what it's battling with is actually a Bigfoot. And so here they are deep in the Rocky Mountains on their snowboards, filming a Yeti and a Bigfoot fighting. And all of a sudden the Bigfoot and the Yeti see them, right? And so they're like, uh-oh, we got to bolt. So they start bolting down the hill. They're going as fast as they can. They're, jumping over boulders. It's like really exciting stuff. The Yeti and the Bigfoot are just after them, racing. And then one of them, let's say Scott was the one holding the camera. Sorry, Scott. Scott drops the GoPro. But obviously they just keep going because they don't want to get caught by the Yeti and the Bigfoot. But when they get to the bottom of the hill and they start telling people in the town, like what happened, nobody believes them, right? So that all their footage, all the proof is in the woods where the Yeti and the Bigfoot live. So they've got to go back and get the footage. But it is quite the adventure. So anyway, I will let you all figure out what happens. Thank you for listening and or watching. We will see you tomorrow.